Good morning to you all. Today we conclude our series on the names of God, and as we do, that will bring an end to our journey through the Old Testament, where these names were progressively revealed to God's people. Just by way of recap, you might remember that we began in Genesis, where God was revealed to Abraham as Yahweh Jireh, the Lord will provide. And then immediately after the exodus of God's people from slavery in Egypt, God made that bitter water sweet for them to drink, and he declared himself to be Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals. And then it wasn't long after that, the people are making their way on their journey, and they encounter their first real opposition from the might of the Amalekite army, and God enabled them to overcome. When Moses was up on the hill and he lifted the staff of God up above his head, the people down below in the valley would win the battle. And he was revealed there as Yahweh Nissi, the Lord my banner. Then we moved on to the book of Leviticus. Now that is a book all about the holiness of God. And there we encounter God as Yahweh M'Kadesh, the Lord who sanctifies. We moved on to the book of Judges, and there it is Gideon, the least man in his family from the least clan in all of Manasseh, who is threshing wheat in a winepress, trying to keep it secure from the might of the Midianite army, when God appears to him, and Gideon declares Yahweh Shalom, the Lord is peace. After that, we moved on to 1 Samuel, and there we encountered the childless Hannah, who was tormented by her rival Peninnah, and she cried out to God in her distress as Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, or the Lord Almighty. And then, of course, on into the Psalms, and to that most well-known of all Psalms, written by the former shepherd boy who became the king, who declares him to be Yahweh Rohi, the Lord my shepherd. And then finally we came to the prophets, and last week we were in the book of Jeremiah, where the prophet Jeremiah spoke into the decline of the monarchy, and he spoke against the kings who had not been good shepherds of God's people, who had scattered the flock. And God promised his people a time of gathering when he himself would be their shepherd, and he would raise up a king for them, a king who would reign wisely, and a king who would do what was just and what was right. And the name of that king would be Yahweh Sidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. And today we move just a little bit further on in our journey with God's people, and we meet a young man named Ezekiel. Now, hopefully most of you can remember back to your 30th birthday, and if not, maybe you're looking forward to your 30th birthday. Our 30s are exciting times. They are times when you've finally sort of loosed the shackles of your parents' control, and you have moved on in life. Most likely you've decided on some direction for your career, and perhaps you're working through some of your career goals. You might be achieving pay rises or promotions as you go. For many, the 30s is a time of, deciding where to live and where to settle down. Perhaps it's a time when you get married, or when children come along for some people, or a time of raising a family. There are lots of exciting things to look forward to in your 30s. Some people travel the world in their 30s. something else that people look forward to. And it was probably no different in the ancient times, and certainly for this young man, Ezekiel, his 30s was expected to contain an important milestone, because 30 was the age of priestly service. And Ezekiel was a man from a priestly family. His father was a priest. He would have spent his life in and around the temple. It would have been the focus of family life. And he would have been well versed in how things worked in the temple, and he would no doubt have looked forward to that time when he himself could enter priestly service just like his father before him had done. But for the young man Ezekiel, that was a milestone that would never happen, because here in his 30th year, he is to be found not in Jerusalem where the temple is. He is a long way separated from that. He is with the exiles in Babylon. And during his time there, that city and the great temple within that city that he loved so much would be destroyed. And we're going to focus today on the very beginning and the very end of the book of Ezekiel, because these two passages kind of stand like bookends for the whole rest of what occurs in the book of Ezekiel, and they kind of hold the whole thing together. And if you get a good grip on the first part and the last part, you'll go a long way to understanding everything that is in between. So if you've got Bibles with you, it will be handy to have them open to the book of Ezekiel. And we're going to begin in the very first chapter. And there we find Ezekiel in his all-important 30th year among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, or river, some versions say, in the land of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, same thing. They're in Babylon. The unthinkable has happened to them. Their land's been invaded and they've been deported into a foreign land. It is a pagan land. They are surrounded by pagan practices, and they would have been mocked by their captors. And it's difficult for us to fully understand the extent of their suffering. They had lost their homes, they'd lost their land, they'd lost their means of producing an income from that land, they'd lost their possessions, and they'd been separated from family and friends. So this is early on in the exile. Just a relatively small number of people had been deported, but even after all of the deportations that happened, not everybody was taken into exile. There was still a great degree of separation from family and friends. And I think we can sort of understand something of this from some of the images that we see on our own news when people are affected by circumstances that see them lose everything and be separated from family and friends. We've got Ukraine, we've got Gaza, we've got Myanmar, many places in Africa where just horrific things are happening to people, and you can just see the despair and the grief and the suffering that is in their eyes on our TV screens. But unless you've really experienced it firsthand, I don't think you can hope to fully understand the depth of what these people are going through. This was that kind of physical crisis, and then some more. It was physical, but it also cut to the heart of who these people were. So it's also an identity crisis. And because the identity of these people is completely tied up in their relationship to God and who they understand themselves to be under God, this is also a very deep theological crisis for these people. They were God's people. They were his chosen people. He himself had brought them out of slavery into the land that he had promised them. And he had made his dwelling among them. The glory of his presence filled the temple. And for as long as anyone could remember, that temple had been the centre of religious life and social life in Israel. And so you can imagine they were wondering, how could this have happened to us? When he had brought them up out of Egypt, the Lord had gone before them as a pillar of cloud in the day, and by night as a pillar of fire, giving them light. But that was a long, long time ago. This generation that finds themselves in exile, they are a people of the promised land. That's what they have known. And for them, their experience of God has been that God dwelt among them, in their midst, in the temple. You will remember that within that temple there was that great curtain, and it was within what they called the Holy of Holies that they understood the presence of God to dwell amongst them. And now they were separated from it. Jerusalem and its temple, and they're over here in a foreign pagan land. That's the kind of crisis that they are going through. It's a physical one, it's a crisis of identity, and it's a crisis of theology. Everything that they understood was built on that foundation of who they were and their relationship, their special relationship to God. That was their foundation, and then one day their foundations weren't just shaken, they were completely ruptured, and life as they understood it would never quite be the same again. And to maybe get a bit of a visual on just what a paradigm shift they were going through, we could maybe think of these people a little bit like the olive farmer in Turkey who went out to discover that his olive grove, not just the trees had disappeared in the wake of last year's earthquake in that country, in Turkey, but the very land which those trees were growing in had disappeared into the earth. Can you imagine standing on the edge of that great ravine that had formed and just looking out and knowing that nothing is going to ever be the same again? That's something of the sense of confusion and disbelief and grief and despair that we find the exiles in by the Kibar Canal in Babylon. And so we can imagine what kind of questions are racing through their heads. How could this have happened? Aren't we the chosen people? Now, of course they were, but they had repeatedly kept turning their backs on God, and that had its consequences. Who are we now without access to the temple, separated from God? Where is God in all of this? And we don't have to go very far through the book of Ezekiel to find the answer to that last question. Chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kibar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. Where was the Lord in all of this? He was there. He was there by the Kibar Canal in the land of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. And what follows for the rest of chapter 1 is a vision of God that confirms this. It's a vision that is enough to blow anyone's mind. I can remember reading this vision when I was quite young, and that was all I read of the book of Ezekiel because it was just too weird to go any further. But it's worth going further. It's worth trying to understand this vision. So as we look at it, there are a couple of things we need to keep in mind. Firstly, it is a vision. That's the first thing we need to remember. Secondly, it is unlike anything anyone else has ever seen before. And sometimes when that happens, when you see something that no one's ever seen before, it's difficult to describe it in a way that kind of makes sense. The words come tumbling out, and that's something of what we have in this first chapter of Ezekiel. The short little sentences, I saw this, and then I saw this, and saw this. The words come tumbling out. By the time we get to chapter 10, he's kind of gathered himself a bit, and he's able to put some perspective on what these things mean and what they are. But here in chapter 1, it's all a little bit chaotic. It's a bit like when a child comes running in from school or from out in the street and they have some very exciting news to tell their parents and they're trying to say it all and it's just not coming out right because they're so excited. I can remember one time Bruce and I had 2 young boys in our care. They were staying with us. One was about 2.5 or 3 and the other one about 6, somewhere between 6 and 7. And they were very active boys. And so we used to take them outside as much as possible. We did lots of bike riding, walks, all that sort of thing. And on one particular occasion, I had taken them to walk the dog. They used to love walking our dog. And so I had the stroller, the younger one was in the stroller, I had the dog, I had the other kid. And we went for a walk in the local cemetery. Now, it's not that strange, not as strange as it sounds. The cemetery near us is a bit like a botanic gardens. It's got nice paths through it, and lots of people walk their dogs there. It's not weird at all. At the top of the cemetery, there was a pond, and the pond had a little waterfall, and the kids loved to go there and throw stones or float leaves and things. And so we'd gone there. And they were throwing stones. And the little one got overexcited and threw himself in with the stone. And that was when I realised how deep the pond was, because he went right under the water. And once I fished him out, it was the middle of winter, he was freezing cold. He stood there like this, trying not to let his legs touch his wet clothes. And he had his hands out like this, and the pond had been full of that slimy algae stuff. And it was hanging in strings from his arms and down his face. And he had his mouth open because he was so cold and shocked, like this. And his brother looked at him. And it was like the bog monster had come to life before his eyes. Now it was cold, the kid's lips are starting to turn blue, so I've thrown him in the stroller and instructed the older boy to run home and get Bruce to bring towels and things to wrap him up. So he takes off, but by the time he gets home, this vision of his brother as the bog monster is just locked in his mind, and he's trying to tell Bruce what he needs to tell him, but all that Bruce could understand was he fell in. Now we were in a cemetery, so you can imagine what Bruce thought. So the next thing I see is just this vision sprinting towards me, no towels, no blankets, no nothing, ready to rescue him from a big hole in the ground. Anyway, that gives you some idea of what it's like when we see something that's just so outside of our imagination. So it's a vision. He's lost for words how to describe it. And the final thing to keep in mind is that while some of the elements in this vision seem completely foreign to us, they weren't to the people at that time. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into great detail about every element in this vision. I just want to give you a feel for what it's trying to communicate to us. By the time he gets to the end of this vision, Ezekiel is in no doubt as to what he has seen. He has seen a vision of Yahweh. and he is face down on the floor. And in that position, he hears a voice that instructs him to stand up. He's filled with the Spirit, and then this vision begins. Now, the vision begins with a description of a windstorm, and I think there's nothing unfamiliar about a windstorm for all of us. We know what that is all about. There is great power in a windstorm, and there is movement. It's innate to the definition of wind that there is movement. If everything is still, there cannot be any wind. John 3:8 tells us the wind blows where it pleases, you hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. And he says, so it is with anyone who is born of the Spirit. Within the wind there is light and there is fire. Now these are symbols of purity, of holiness, and of judgment. Judgment is coming. And this is where things start to get really bizarre for today's readers. Many artists have tried to capture something of this vision for us, and I wouldn't say that any of them have necessarily got it entirely right. We could never know. But for those of us who are less creative, at least their efforts kind of help us to imagine what Ezekiel was looking at. There are 4 creatures. He describes them as like living creatures, and they have 4 wings each. And under the 4 wings are hands like human hands. And they have 4 faces. Each of them have 4 faces, straight legs, and they have feet like a calf, so like a cow's foot. Now, by chapter 10, Ezekiel identifies these as cherubim, but not as Westerners imagine cherubim, as pudgy, pleasant, smiling children with wings. Okay, these are biblical cherubim. And they are much more like the guardian winged bullman that could typically be found at that time supporting the throne or standing guard outside a Mesopotamian temple or palace. Okay, so these are elements that have some familiarity to the people. They would be familiar to them as attendants of deity. And that's how this vision would have been understood by Ezekiel and others at the time. The 4 heads are a mystery to us. It just sounds completely bizarre. But they were also made up of familiar symbols from art and statues of that era. There's the ferocity and the strength and the courage of the lion. There is the majesty and the speed of the eagle, the wisdom and the dignity of the human who is made in God's own image. And then there's the ox, a symbol of fertility and divinity. Now, we don't have time to explore any of that any further. Above these creatures, over and above them, verse 25 says, is an expanse. And above that, a throne that looked like sapphire, and on the throne, what looked like the figure of a man whose appearance is like glowing metal and fire, surrounded by some sort of brilliant light like a rainbow. This is powerful, powerful stuff. But for today's purposes, all I really want to take note of is that about half of this entire description is devoted to movement. There's the windstorm, there's several descriptions of these 4 living creatures speeding back and forth, and then there's this amazing description of these wheels that are covered with eyes, denoting that God can see everything. And these wheels that are covered with eyes. They move in every direction, but they don't turn like a normal wheel. They just allow movement in every direction. And their source of power doesn't come from an engine. If you read through that description 4 separate times, we are told it is the Spirit that is associated with the movement of these wheels. This is a vision of God in all his power and in all of his sovereignty. But the most important aspect for these exiles, who for the past 5 years have been wondering, where is God? Has he abandoned us? The most important aspect is this notion of movement that is all throughout this vision. Yahweh is not confined to the temple. He's not confined to Jerusalem, and he's not confined to the promised land. He is there, right with them where they are in exile. And he's come in judgment. The fire and the lightning speak that he's come in judgment, but undoubtedly he is there. And what a complete shift in their understanding that would have been to people who perhaps believed themselves to have been abandoned by God or beyond where God could reach. Yahweh was there, and he had a job for Ezekiel to do. Face down on the floor, he hears a voice, commanded to stand up. The Spirit comes into him, and he's commissioned as a prophet to these people in exile. And he has a most unenviable task. He is to proclaim God's judgment upon the people. He's to proclaim God's judgment on the nations. He is to warn them of the coming fall of Jerusalem. And then later on in the book, he brings messages of comfort and restoration. And then he describes in great detail the new city and the new temple. And the final part of the book describes the 12 gates of the city that are named after the 12 tribes of Israel, which underscores that this is a place for all of God's people. Now that was read to us this morning by Yulong, and the description, you might remember, concluded like this: and the name of the city from that time on will be, and in Hebrew, Yahweh Shammah, or the Lord is there, it says in our English Bibles. And this is a wonderful message of hope for the exiles. God was there with them in Babylon, and he would be there with them in the new city when their time of exile was complete. But this is also a wonderful message of hope for us, because in spite of that detailed description that was given of the wall and the gates and the names of the gates and all of that sort of thing, no such arrangement has ever been built in the history of Jerusalem. It is yet to come. Jerusalem was rebuilt, its temple was rebuilt. You know, the people returned from their exile and they got to work rebuilding the temple and the city, and they were encouraged by various prophets and others in their efforts to do that. But Ezekiel is at pains in his writings, or in what he said, to keep the description of that temple and that of the land that would be allocated to the city as quite separate from one another. And whilst his description of the temple and of the glory of God re-entering and filling that is something quite to behold, the closing line of the book leaves us in no doubt as to where God is. God is not confined to the temple. It says the name of the city, not the name of the temple, the name of the city from that time on will be Yahweh Shammah. Now, the city is where people live and they work and they play and they raise families and they do all of the mundane things of life that we do. And that was where God would be. He would be there with his people through it all, through whatever came. He was there with them in Babylon. He would be there with them when they returned from exile and the new city was built. He would later on be there with them as Jesus, God Emmanuel, God with us. He remains with us by his Holy Spirit. But we have the fulfillment of this prophecy to look forward to when we dwell there in the holy city, the New Jerusalem, together. When we're all gathered together and the holy city, which is the bride, the wife of the Lamb, who is Jesus, and when it all comes together. And so, like all of the other names that we've discussed so far in this series, this one also finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus when we are all gathered together in that place. Chapter 21 of John's Revelation, the last book in our Bibles, describes this magnificent city, and the description of the gates is almost identical to that which you find in Ezekiel. It has 12 gates, 3 on each of the 4 sides of the city, each containing the names of one of those tribes of Israel. It is a place of safety and it is a place of peace for God's people, a place where he is their God, where they are his people. He is Yahweh, Shammah, in that place. The Lord is there. And so that prophecy will find its fulfillment and will be part of its fulfillment when we reach that place, that holy city, the New Jerusalem. Sarah, hopefully, is somewhere around, and she's going to lead us in our closing song. Here she comes, running in, leaving the baby behind, running in. We're going to stand and we're going to sing. We're going to sing a song that's been chosen, speaks of Jesus and the way that he is the fulfillment of each of these names that we've worked our way through this series. The song is All to Us.